Alright, good evening everybody. Hope you're having a super evening. Come and say hello in the chat if you're just hanging out. Who have we got in the chat so far? We've got Prop Forward, good to see you back again. Pilsner, how's it going? Hope you're having a great evening over there. Is it Bruno? I think it is. Good evening, how are you doing? Alice, thanks for joining. Nice to see you again. Yearning9, thanks for coming back to stream again, much appreciated. Sandpatch, awesome, nice to see you back again. And Atagai, thanks very much, thanks for joining. Awesome, thanks Bruno. Is the audio okay for everybody? Any issues with the quality of the audio so far? So this is the 5x5, thanks very much, awesome. This is the Turbine Islander by TorqueSim, released about an hour or so ago. But I guess if you're on the stream, you probably know that already. I love the Islander. It's one of my all-time favourite aircraft. Just the utilitarian awesomeness of it. I don't think there's a bad angle on the aircraft. It looks awesome. It's very capable for what it does, and I think with these turbine engines, it makes a huge difference to the aircraft. I've been flying Islanders in simulators for about 20 years or so, with the FlightSim 2004, FlightSim 2002 with the MR software version, Marcel Kunt, I think it was. And I spent hundreds of hours flying that thing. When TorqueSim released the Piston aircraft last year, I bought it on release day because it's just an aircraft I've been waiting for. If you've got the Piston aircraft already, the good news for you is the turbine aircraft. I think it's even better. It's finished to a higher standard. Its texturing is awesome, the modelling is awesome, and the sounds are really good. By way of full disclosure, I've been invited by TorqueSim onto the beta program for the Islander. I joined the beta program about 3 days or so ago. So what you're seeing here is a beta version of the product. I haven't updated to the release version yet, and also obviously I was given this aircraft by TorqueSim. I haven't bought it as a commercial customer. That being said, just like the videos on YouTube, I try not to reviews of aircraft, but rather let's just fly it, let's just enjoy it, and see what we can do with it. So let's jump inside and have a look. It is, as I said, really nicely modelled, in my opinion. One of the great things about the turbine aircraft is these extra fuel tanks. We've got tip tanks as well as the main tanks on the aircraft. And you kind of really need that because it's quite thirsty when it's got the turbine engines. It's burning about 50 or 60 gallons an hour, so obviously you need slightly more fuel on the aircraft. Hey Amy, good to see you. We're in Cumbernauld, Amy. We may be heading your way in just a few moments. So on the load and balance screen here, you fill up the tanks as usual, just like you do with the Piston aircraft. Hey Toto, good to see you. But one of the odd things about the aircraft is the wingtip tanks. They are really to be kept full of fuel. You use the main tanks first, leaving fuel in the tips, which sounds kind of back to front. We'll have a look at that when we get airborne. But as you fill the aircraft up, you'll see it fills up the main tanks last, fills up the tip tanks first. Ready to wave, Amy? Well, you see, I might need to go and check what's been happening at Dundee Airport as well. I've put ex-Europe on my simulator, and they've built some kind of obstruction on the apron. HPA setting, that caught me out as well. Sammy, watch this. Come down here, click on the altimeter, and it flicks over to HPA scale, and that happens on both sides. So you do have HPA available. You've just got to click the button on it or click the screen, the instrument itself. Yeah, I didn't know that until a few days ago. I've been flying the Piston aircraft for a year and looking down at this chart here to try and work out what pressure setting I'm supposed to have. Shall we get it fired up and see how it works? It's a very straightforward aircraft, the Islander, to operate. Lots of the aircraft is laid out very logically, and then you get some things that are just weird, just stuff that makes no sense. But top to bottom, left to right, is usually a good way to start. So the rudder trim's up here. and then you've got the fuel tank selectors. They're really obvious up here, they're not hidden away. If you've got aircraft like a Seneca, the fuel tank selectors, the crossfeeds can be behind your seat or somewhere else really out of place. To start the aircraft, the first flight of the day, it's my preference to start the aircraft in the cross tank configuration, simply to verify that the crossfeed system works on the aircraft. I want to make sure that I can feed fuel across the aircraft just to be sure before we start it up. We've got the heater and the vent blower, make sure they're both selected off. Ignition off, starter off, fuel pumps off. We've already talked about the fuel quantities. And in a similar vein to the fuel selectors here, we've got to choose the fuel tanks. Now remember I said we're going to drain the main tanks first of all, but I'm going to start on the tip tanks because I want to make sure that the switch mechanism, the valve, which is electrically signaled, I want to make sure that works correctly. Across the top here, there's nothing else to do at the moment. Onto the main panel, we've got the pitot heaters here, so that everything is selected off with the exception of the nav lights. I tend to just leave those switched on so that, you know, in a real aircraft, if you walk away from it, you turn around and have a look at it, it's a very obvious thing that you've left the nav lights on, so you've probably left the master switch on as well. So nav lights on. This aircraft has got some failures simulated as well, so we're going to double check and make sure that all the circuit breakers are in, which they are. Coming down to the pedestal here, just make sure the trim is set to the index here. Power levers, make sure they're at the flight idle or the idle detent, and the condition levers are selected off. Parking brake is set. We're ready to fire it up. So it's a very simple aircraft, as I said. I'm going to lift the bar here, bring the battery to life. You can hear it start to spin up. We need to check the light and initiators here. So we've got generators, fuel pressure and oil pressure. That's what we'd expect. Most importantly, we've got the doors closed, because one of the really great things about the Islander in real life, although maybe the pilots don't think so day in, day out, is the fact that you're a single pilot operation in the majority of cases. Things like closing the doors and briefing the passengers, that's something the pilots have got to do by themselves as well. So we've got the battery selected on, and it's simply a case of getting it ready to start up. I'll put the cabin lights and the passenger notices on, put the beacon on to tell people around the aircraft that we're about to start the aircraft. Then it's got this really odd switch down here. If you're new to the Islander, external supply and start isolator, you're only going to look at external supply and think, what's that for? Why do we need that? I don't need that. Well, if you don't put that to external supply, you won't be able to start the engines. I don't understand why it's labelled that way, but there we go. That's what it is. And that's the real aircraft. The real aircraft is genuinely like that. Just some weirdness there. Having done all of that, it's really straightforward. We'll start the right engine first of all. So check the right engine's clear. I shall put the fuel pump on, the igniters on, and hold the switch to start to the right. Check for the gas generator coming up to 14, and just increase the condition lever to the detent there. I'll keep my mouse on it, and we'll keep an eye on the temperatures as they come up, make sure it doesn't go too hot. Seems fine, not too hot there. Once the gas generator gets above 50%, we can flick the starter off, keep an eye on the temperatures. All is good. Propeller's winding up. There's one engine running. We'll repeat the same for the left hand side, so we're clear on the left, fuel pump on, ignition on, clear left, start left, gas generators coming up, bring the lever to the detent. Temperatures are good. Above 50%, and we'll switch the starter off. Up she comes. And with that, we'll just bring the power levers all the way to the top. Just give me a second, I'll just check the sound in OBS, make sure the engines aren't too loud for you. Hopefully that's about right there. So with the engines running, it's just a case of starting everything else up now. We are going to switch off the ignition for the time being. and I'll switch off the fuel pumps. We want to make sure that the combustion is self-sustaining on the engines, so I'm going to switch the ignition off. I don't have the flight manual for this aircraft. I've only got the documentation from TorqueSim, so this may not be a real life procedure, but in my mind it's sensible to verify the engine works by itself. We shall set the fuel tanks back to the normal configuration now, so the same left tank to left engine, right tank to right engine, and also go from the tip tanks to the main tanks. We'll put the cabin ventilator on now to make sure there's some fresh air coming into the cabin for those passengers. Across the top here you'll see that we're still draining the battery. We're only showing 25 volts. That's a surefire sign it's running on the battery only. So switch the instrument selector over to the right gen, and then we'll put the generator on the bus. Make sure the voltage increases and we're showing green charging. It's perfect. Do the same on the left hand side. Flick the generator on, and we see they're sharing the load equally between them now. That's perfect. So with all the generators online, we can flick on the avionics and we'll switch off that start supply, or the external supply start isolator. And that is the aircraft fired up. Just a few checks and then we're good to go. It has got what's called a slaving compass on this side. It's got a magnetic flux detector, and what it does is it basically always aligns the directional gyro for you. But you've got to verify the slaving. If it's in free mode, you can steer the gyro just like any older aircraft, but you put it into slaving mode and make sure that it aligns to the heading. You can check that on the compass as well. The compass is hidden behind this add-on panel there, so it's showing what, yeah, just about the same, 260. And we'll check on the other side as well. So this side is a manual gyro. We've got to align that ourselves. There we go. What did I say? 260. There's the generator assisted starts like you can do it in the King Air. I don't know, Amy. I would really like to find a proper flight manual to fully understand the systems on the aircraft. It's a Allison 250, a Rolls-Royce or Detroit diesel Allison 250 turboprop rather than the PT6, so it's a bit different from what we may have seen in a previous aircraft. Excellent, we've got the avionics powered up. I'll just bring the transponder on. I'll stick it straight onto alt. And all we've really got to do is verify the electric trim's working, so I'll just move the trim with the electric switches, do a flight control check as we're sitting here, make sure everything behaves itself, and I'll set the flaps as well. I'll run the flaps all the way to the down position, and then back up to takeoff. Quite a crowd on the Islander here. The Trilander must look even more scary for the pilots, you know, turning around and seeing your customers right there behind you. Keep an eye on them, huh? Excellent, so I think we have pretty much done everything. Should be ready to taxi out. Oh, one last thing, I'm going to set the altitude on the autopilot to 2,500 feet just as an alerter. What's that on the DA400 Toto? Not to have to twiddle the knob. Oh, the slaving compass, yeah, no, absolutely. It's you kind of forget that you've got to do that. Right, one of the oddities with X-Plane default engine handling is the beta setting on the propeller. So I just want to show you this before we start off. I've got very basic hardware. I don't have any detents on my hardware joystick. So I have a key binding for toggle reverse and a key binding for toggle beta. One of the weirdities of no, hang on. Yeah, let me just allow that. There we go. One of the weirdities about the X-Plane system is you can't get it into beta unless you go into reverse first, sometimes. So I put it into reverse and then we'll get beta, and I've now got beta control. So what beta means is you're controlling the propeller pitch directly. It means that you can accelerate and slow down on the ground without changing the revolutions on the engine. It gives you finer control. So with that, check we're clear left and we're clear right, clear ahead. There's no taxi lights. We'll leave the landing lights off just now. And I'll release the brakes, and off we go. It's a bit of an uneven apron here at Cumbernauld. I've been doing some work on the ortho, and I've ended up with these rather exciting shapes on the apron. It's not what I had in mind. Right, and we're moving. Just going to have to take it out of beta for a second, get her moving, so a little bit more power. Right, we'll go very slowly here because there's a few bumps. I really don't think the apron in Cumbernauld is like this. That would be a bad thing. Cumbernauld is the home of the Islander in Scotland. There's a company at Cumbernauld that rebuilds them, so they'll bring old airframes from all over the world and bring them up here. Yeah, it's been quite a big landslide here, Toto, that's for sure. So as I bring the power lever back, you can see that we're slowing down without using the brakes. That's the benefit of beta, you've got much finer control. So if you find the aircraft's running away on the ground, you probably want to have the beta control set up. Now come to a halt, we'll set the parking brake and we'll just run through some of the checks that we've got to do. So before entering the runway, we're going to reconfigure the aircraft for flight. Remember, I've got the ignition and the fuel pump selected off to verify that it works. That everything's behaving itself in the normal condition, but for the takeoff we want the protection of having the ignition on and the fuel pumps on. Whilst I'm up here, I'm going to check the flaps, check that we are tank to engine, that's left to left and right to right, and make sure that we're on the main tank if there's fuel in it. We've got 40 gallons and full tanks over here. On the panel, as we line up, I'll put the pitot heat, the landing lights on, and we'll just verify the trim and verify condition levers are full forward. With that, we are good to line up. So brakes coming off. I think Sandpash, what's happened is, I don't know if all of the airports I've been flying into are detected by Ortho4XP. I think that's maybe the issue. Maybe the boundaries from OpenStreetMap aren't the same as the boundaries in X-Plane. So I'm not 100% sure how Ortho4XP does it, but if it's using the OSM boundaries rather than the X-Plane boundaries, that could potentially cause some interesting things. There's an airfield just north of here called Strathallan, and I was flying the Islander into Strathallan earlier today, and there's a huge lump on the runway, so we'll not be going there. It was doable, but took a bit of care, shall we say. I've been messing around, Pom, with it quite a bit. It's good for some airports and bad for others. This is the best I've seen Cumbernauld with the Ortho, and ex-Europe makes a huge difference as well. But when we get to Dundee, we can have a look at some oddities there. So basically this is the power lever as far forwarded in beta as it will go, and we're just kind of getting through about 10 to 12 knots ground speed. It's fine. What do you think of the sounds on the Islander so far? I love you hear the prop change as we change the pitch, as we change the blade pitch. I think that sounds really good. It's interesting. Yeah, it's cool. You want to see, wait to see what happens when we get there, Amy. It's quite different now. We've kind of rendered the whole parking area a bit useless. So I'll put the blades to flat pitch, that will slow us down a little bit. So I'm still not touching the brakes. And we'll line up on the runway. So the Islander does everything at 65 knots. Your final approach is 65 knots, your climb out is 65 knots. Best rate, best angle, single engine, it's all 65 knots. If you look at the manuals, there are lower speeds in there if you're really limited on that runway, but for the most part 65 knots is all you really need to keep in mind for the Islander. Just a final check, we've got ignition, we've got fuel pumps, we've got fuel selection, we've got the pitot heat, the condition levers, we are good to go. Well, let's see how this goes. Off we go. got to be careful not to over torque the engines on takeoff, so smoothly with the power. 95 to 100 is fine, keeping it straight with the rudders. There's 40 knots, checked on both sides. 50, 55, just ease back on the stick. And there we go. I'm just going to set that pitch attitude, just put the horizon roughly on the top of the instrument panel. It's about 10 degrees, and I'll just need to adjust the trim a little bit and just put some rudder trim on there. And climbing at 70, accelerating to 75 or so. Once we're 200 feet above the ground, we can retract the flaps. What we've got to make sure is that the aircraft doesn't sink. So as I take the flaps up, just keep a little bit of back pressure, increase the pitch attitude ever so slightly, and then what I do is keep climbing at a reasonable pitch attitude to about 500 feet above the field elevation, and then I'll just lower the nose and let the aircraft accelerate in the climb. So what I'll do is just ease the nose down a little bit, and we'll start our turn. It's really a really straightforward aircraft to operate, but it's in some respects it's quite challenging to fly. The nature of short takeoff and landing aircraft is just such that you've got to be careful with them. So I'm going up to 2,500 feet. What I'm going to do is just roll the wings level momentarily. Just going to give the flight control to the autopilot for a second, and I'll bring up the Avatab here. I should have had this started. See if I've got a chart. There we go. So we're in this airspace here. This is Glasgow on the left and Edinburgh on the right, and this wedge here, we're safe up to, well, we can cruise at 2,500 feet. 3,000 feet is where the Class D airspace begins. While the autopilot has the aircraft, as we're climbing away, I'm going to select the fuel pumps off. Just verify the fuel pressure warning light doesn't come on. I'm also going to reduce the power ever so slightly, come back to about 75% initially, and then I'll just bring the condition levers back till we bring the prop RPM down. You don't need to do that. You're able to operate the aircraft at max RPM all the time, but bringing the props back just makes it a little bit quieter. So having done that, I'll take the autopilot out, and I'll just reset the pitch attitude to about 5 degrees, and it will continue the climb for the next 100 feet or so, and then we are in the cruise. How does it sound, everybody? Can you hear it okay? Can you hear me over the aircraft okay? Would you like the aircraft to be louder? Islanders are supposed to be noisy. All good, excellent, thanks brought forward. So I'm just going to keep the power setting where it was. We'll level at 2,500 feet. Now, as I said, I'm not 100% sure about the real handling of these Allison engines with regards to the ignition. So, what I would do is select the ignition off. On bigger turbine aircraft, the ignition is only really used if there's a chance of there being an interruption to the airflow. So we run the ignition when there's a likelihood of that happening. Takeoff and landing, high power settings, flaps and slats, anything like that could cause an issue. We'll turn the ignition on. Just reading through the chat here as well. Thanks, Jono. Good to hear. It does have noise cancelling headphones down here, but I like to fly it with those off just to hear the awesome sounds of the engines. It is default, Alec. I've got a sky texture pack, I think, a free one from the .org. Other than that, it's standard. We've got X Europe and Author 4XP down below. Icing conditions, it's got the icing gear on it. Is it certified for flight in knowing icing conditions? We've got the icing equipment we can select on the airframe. It says it's not approved for flight in known icing conditions, and I can believe that. Impact icing, you'd want to be able to remove that, but I don't think I would deliberately fly an Islander into icing conditions. The The Piston aircraft especially is not overly blessed with performance on one engine, and you've got to be really careful with them. Just bringing the autopilot back on for a second, we'll have a look outside at this magnificent aircraft. We are overhead Stirling at the moment. I tend to fly with the landing lights on when I'm flying GA. Landing light bulbs are reasonably cheap compared to a mid-air collision, so landing lights on at low levels. As I said, I've always loved the Islander. I think it's a fantastic looking machine. The tip tanks add a little bit of wingspan, and it makes it look even better, in my opinion. You're all good with the vibration? Yeah. It would shake the ice off. Just through the tail of the aircraft just now, that's the Wallace Monument in Stirling, William Wallace Monument here, and the castle's down here somewhere. There's the castle. So it kind of looks a bit like a castle with ex-Europe. It's pretty nice. And we are going to head over to Dundee, so I'll just click the autopilot out again. Freedom! Oh, everyone would be complaining about the noise of an Islander. It does look really nice, doesn't it, Yearning? I think it's a stunning looking model. I loved the Piston aircraft when I first got it. This one, I don't know, I can't put my finger on one big thing that they've changed, but there's lots of little things that are just so much nicer on it. It's really nice. And it's a very stable aircraft once you're flying it. I think in real life they're quite heavy to fly. Some of the pilots' reports talk about having to lead them into turn with the rudder to a certain extent. But it's a miniature airliner. It doesn't shake anymore when connecting. They've improved that sandpitch. One of the bits of feedback I gave them on the beta program was the engagement. So if you engage with this, it will. What it does now. Well, I'll go back to the beginning. The reason it shakes is due to X-Plane's rather average autopilot implementation. X-Plane keeps the flight directors in the wings level position on the horizon by default, and when you click the autopilot on, X-Plane brings the flight directors in and then sticks the autopilot on straight away. So the flight directors are still moving behind the scenes while the autopilot couples up to them. So what it does now is when you engage it, it brings in the flight directors and then waits for a few frames before bringing the autopilot on. So it's doing a very similar thing to what the Lua script for the Piston aircraft does. It's a lot better. It's just one of the many little refinements it's got. Remember, if you're using the autopilot to capture an altitude, you've got to tell it to arm, otherwise it will just blast right through. Joey prop forward. The Trilander, goodness me, that's an aircraft that divides opinion, isn't it? Some people love it, some people hate it. I think it looks amazing. Clockwork TriStar. Yeah, I never flew the Flight 1 Islander, Sammy. I had the free one, which I really enjoyed. It was a bit of a faff to get it installed, but once it was installed, it was good fun. I must have flown that thing for hundreds of hours. Autopilot. You don't like the Trilander, Jono? Part of me thinks it's because of the nose. Part of me thinks it's because the Trilander everybody thinks of is Joey, and I don't know if Arini did their best to make it look ugly or what, but it's a weird looking thing. How'd you get more oil into the tail engine? Step ladders, I think. Yeah. There's another interesting thing. On the Trilander, they've got different propellers on the now in the last years of their service with Arini. They had different propellers on the wings than they did on the tail. They had a two-blade propeller, which is the most efficient way of working, but two blades are noisier because the propeller diameter is larger to absorb the power from the engine, so the tips travel at a faster speed. So if you fit a 3-blade or a 4-blade prop, you can absorb the same amount of power with a smaller diameter, and a smaller diameter reduces the tip speed. So to try and keep the noise on the Trilander down a little bit, they fitted 3-blade props to it, but they couldn't fit a 3-blade prop to the tail engine, so the tail engine still has a 2-blade prop. Yeah, noisy tips, exactly. Oh, thanks, Sandpatch. So you can operate in not more severe than light. What a wonderfully British way of saying light icing only. Yeah, it is noisy. I think it doesn't help that your head is right next to the propeller. You don't really want to be sticking your hands out there. Pilot, pitot airframe, window heating and electric torch needed. So we've got pitot heating, you can see that's on. We've got airframe anti-ice. You can toggle that on and off actually on the model. You can see we've got the boots on the leading edge, and we've got prop anti-ice as well. The propeller anti-ice. You can see the gauge for it up here, and the switch for it down here. I'm trying to think why you'd need the torch. I'm guessing you need the torch because it doesn't have an ice light. Yeah, you would need the torch so that you can actually have a look at the leading edges and the spinners to see if it was building ice. Some of the I've flown aircraft with clear view panels on the perspex for ice protection, and they are not ideal. You get a bit of distortion, visual distortion through them. On multi-engine piston aircraft that are cleared for known icing conditions, you need the heater to work as well, because the heater obviously is one of your ways of keeping frost off the windscreen. It doesn't have any other heating on the majority of the windscreen, just this little clear view panel, which, to be honest, if you're down to clear view panel, it's not gone well for you. Jono, that is very common with propeller turboprop aircraft. If you have a look at any Dash 8 or any propeller aircraft where the engines are quite close to fuse, you'll see a doubler panel on the skin. It's very obvious on the Dash 8 because it curves its way between the windows, but that is basically almost an attrition panel, so that it gets to the point, it just picks up damage from the ice, and when it gets sufficiently damaged they replace it with another panel. Propellers and ice don't really go together. So this is in my mind a little DC-3. It cruises at 140 knots, at the power setting I'm using 140 knots. Takeoff and landing's about, I don't know, 15 knots slower than a DC-3, and it can get into shorter fields, but it has the feeling for me of a DC-3. Plus you can see when you're going, you can see where you're going when it's on the ground as well. That's good. Where do I go from now, Amy? This is the Firth of Tay ahead of us. We've got Perth is out there on the left hand side. Perth Airport is up there, and Dundee directly ahead of us. Directly over these hills here is Lookers. It used to be a Royal Air Force base. I think it's now a combined Army Services camp or something. Some streams if a decent one becomes available. For DC-3, I really want the leading edge DC-3 to be awesome. It's looking really good. So if the yeah, as soon as that comes out, I'll be getting that and having a look at it. I've got the AeroWorks DC-3. That's pretty good. Progress is fairly slow on it, but it flies nicely. But yeah, with the leading edge one will be awesome. It does look nice, Amy, doesn't it? It's I redid all the ortho a few days ago to put textures, not textures, decals on them, which seems to have helped. So let me put that autopilot back on for a second, and what we'll do is just set the GPS. I'm simply going to do all the way to the right on the knobs here, and then I'm going to pick EGPN. I go direct to EGPN, execute. I'll put it into OBS mode, and I shall use the OBS knob to set the inbound runway. I'm going to land on runway 27, I think it's 27, the westerly runway at Dundee. By using the OBS, I've got this cross-track indication there, so you can help position the aircraft on downwind. Sorry, the stream just seems to have dropped out on the laptop here. 1 second, make sure it's still up and running. Can everybody still hear me? Just make sure it was only one of my computers that dropped out and not the other. Sweet, thanks Sampatch. Cool, yeah, so I find depth perception in the sim to be pretty hard. So I use the OBS to help out. 272. I don't know if I can be that precise, Amy. Oh yeah, we can. ETK. So there we go. That's the inbound track to Dundee. So that's all I'm using the GPS for at this moment. So I'll try and stay to the south. There's a para-jump area here at Argyle. You can just about see it on the little map here. This is Argyle, and there's Lookers down here. Those airways aren't a factor for us. So one of the great things, if you've watched the TorqueSim SR22 series, one of the things I was trying to get across on that series is the challenges of operating a high-performance piston aircraft. The 540, 550 engines, they produce a lot of heat, and you've got to be really careful about managing those aircraft in the descent so they don't get too cold. And you've got to be careful in the climb to make sure they don't get too hot. Just the nature of piston aircraft. With this aircraft, you don't have any of that at all. You can make big power changes without any real drama for the engine whatsoever. So it's quite carefree when it comes to handling. Before we leave the cruise altitude, I'm going to put the ignition back on. I'll put the fuel pumps back on. And what else do I have to do? Double check we've got brake pressure, make sure the brakes are off. And we'll bring the props up, we'll make it closer to the airfield. All I'm going to do is bring some power off, bring some torque off, and I'm going to set it up for 500 feet a minute descent. So remember, we're flying, you know, a little airliner here. We've got commercial passengers on board. We don't want them to have sore ears in the descent. So we'll reduce our rate of descent to around about 500 feet a minute if we can. Has anybody ever been a passenger on an airliner, having been on holiday and maybe picked up a holiday cold and had to fly back with sore ears? It's not a pleasant place to be at all. If all you have is sore ears, then you've done well out of that scenario. It's not nice. I've had one or two cabin crew effectively incapacitated as a result of barotrauma. And that's involved a trip to the hospital. It's not pleasant. So if you're going to go flying little airplanes, don't do it with a cold. Don't do it if there's any restriction in your ears whatsoever. Excellent. So the great thing about Dundee is these bridges. We've got the rail bridge and the road bridge. Do you remember the TBM series from last year that we were trying to do circling at Dundee? Well, this is a few knots slower than the TBM, so we can do lovely tight circuits at Dundee. Do tight circuits anywhere. Flap limiting speeds, I think it's 114 knots for the first stage, the takeoff stage, and you can see the white arc there. It's about, I don't know, 87 or so for full flap. And you can land it with half flap, that's no problem at all. Yeah, never fly with a cold, Sammy, it's not nice. So the fact we've got carefree handling of the engines with regard to temperatures in the descent means that we can actually carry a lot more energy towards the airfield than the Piston, because I can make a full power reduction on the aircraft and it won't cause any problems. So on the Piston, I'd be starting to think about slowing down right about now, but there's no need, we can take it a lot closer in. About 2 miles, 2.5 miles cross track. You can see the airfield out there on the left. Everybody wave to Amy. Doesn't it just look awesome? The texturing on it is just fantastic. Right, we'll start bringing the power off now. I'm going to level at 1,000 feet just for a moment or so. So we've got the ignition on, we've got the fuel pumps on, we've got sufficient fuel, and obviously the gear. Well, we don't need to worry about the gear, do we? It's very strong undercarriage in the Islander for shocks, but that big long spindly undercarriage doesn't like side loads, so although it's very solidly built, you've got to make sure you get the drift off if you're landing on a crosswind. It doesn't like side loads on the gear. Right, bring that power off. So that line of trees there is where we're going to aim to turn final over that. 100 knots, I'll take the first stage of flaps, and with the flaps to stage 1 I'm going to bring the condition levers forward. So flaps out, props up, brakes off. It's like having a speed brake, absolutely. Look at the speed come back there with the flaps and the props. Always trim your airplane as well. It's one of the things we forget in the sim. It's very easy to hold pressure on the aircraft in the sim, but always trim. The one area you've got to be careful with the turbine, where the propeller, the piston, sorry, is a bit more carefree, is that of the acceleration rate on the engines. If you need extra power on the piston, you can really whack it in straight away, whereas with the turbine it takes a little bit of time to spool up, and there's a more pronounced pitch change as well. So, final stage of flaps. Catch the balloon, as they say, lower the nose and retrim. See how this goes. Oh, I'm out of trim. Disaster. Not worrying about the pappies because we're aiming for the threshold. Make sure I've got power. So the pappies are for the instrument markings. In this case, we're going to see if we can do a short landing. See if I can avoid screwing it up. Looking at the far end of the runway. Float. Into reverse. And we'll bring into beta. And that's us on the ground at Dundee, ready for the first exit here, without any, just a touch of wheel braking there. It's a phenomenal little aircraft. You've got to be really careful with it in the final stages though. Just make sure that you've got that power spooled up. So leaving the runway, I'll take the pitot heat off and I'll bring the flaps up. We can have the ignition off, the fuel pumps off. We're only going to taxi back and do this all again, so no worries. That'll do us for just now. Trundle in, see what Dundee looks like today. What is this? Why are there porta cabins all over the parking area? I do not understand it. I do not understand it. It's Dundee's a great airfield to fly from for practicing circuits because the river and the bridges just makes it really obvious. Yeah, this is just the gateway scenery, John. Just going to offset the right a little bit here with these big long wings. Make sure we're not gonna... Yeah, we're good. Need Orbex. I don't know if I could run Orbex Pilsners. It wasn't like this before at X-Europe, so I think X-Europe has added something. There's maybe an exclusion area missing on the apron or something. That's what I was thinking upon. EGPN if you want to take a look. Right, we'll come to a halt and then we'll reset the aircraft for the takeoff. Should we try a circuit, see if we can get a more instrumenty kind of landing out of that. Parking brake set, come out of beta range. So flaps back to takeoff, ignition goes on, the pumps go on. Check the fuel selectors, the tank selectors. Coming down here, I'm going to reset the trim to the detent. I'm going to make sure my condition levers are full forward. Everything else is already set, landing lights and P-type can come on. Let's go do some circuits. Well, maybe just one circuit and a touch and go, how about that? So Dundee is 1,300 odd metres long. It's not a long runway. They operate Saabs and I think they operate ATRs out of here as well. It's a bit on the short side for a jet, but for an Islander, oh my goodness, it's about 4 times longer than it needs to be. If it was a really short runway, I'd hold max brakes, hold it on the toe brakes, and I'd bring the torque up just to make sure that I get the torque where it needs to be, and then release the brakes. It's alive, both sides. 50, 55, easy rotation. We've got a positive climb. Off we go. 200 feet, I'll take the flaps up just for the climb. Adjust the pitch to offset any sink that we get. And I'll just keep pitching up this time. 6 stop and goes. Is that Bergen sand patch? Yeah. Very scenic Bergen. Right, clear on the left, so roll left. You see the climb rate is, I mean it's still very heavy, this aircraft. It's not actually much more powerful than the Piston in the grand scheme of things, but it makes the difference. The extra power makes the difference. The extra wingspan makes a difference as well. The wings are slightly longer with those tip tanks. Yeah, you can go faster in this sand patch. The fuel burn is horrific when you're going faster. I mean, it's burning more fuel than a TBM and it's doing 170 knots indicated. But, you know, it's not built to go fast, it's built to get out of short strips. Excellent. On the downwind, I'll just bring the power back so we don't accelerate, and just check that trim. So you can easily cruise around the circuit at 70 knots if you need to. If you're at a terrain confined airfield, you can make your radius of turn tiny if you need to. Take the first stage of flap, I'll let the aircraft slow down. Quite a trim change when you select the flaps, and then you have to retrim again as the speed comes off, so you have to, sometimes it's easier just to hold a bit of forward pressure as you deploy the flaps, because if you retrim nose down, you'll end up retrimming nose up again when the flaps are in the position you've selected. Start the descent now, start the turn. So let's see if we can do a touch and go, and then we'll head off somewhere else. Can you land it with a flap malfunction? Yeah, you should be able to land it flapless. You can side slip it if necessary and set yourself up on a longer approach. It shouldn't be a major problem. Flaps are out, props are up, brakes off. start trim again because I'm looking at the chat in the circuit. I shouldn't really be doing that. Yeah, I don't want to get low this time. I'm going to power on. So I've only been flying this since Tuesday. In the same time period I had that PT-19 video to edit and record the voiceover for, and French helicopter shenanigans as well, so it's been a sim heavy kind of week. So this is the kind of scenario the turbine can catch you out. If you're doing a steeper final descent, not a problem on the piston because you've got instant power response, but you really want the torque to be spooled up a little bit on the turbine. So looking at the far end of the runway, adjusting the nose attitude, power to idle, holding it, nose coming up, and we go. I don't need reverse. What I'll do is I'll set the flaps up, I'll just nose the trim the right way, make sure we're on the centre line, and bring the power up. That's enough. 60 and rotate. Do you remember doing circuits here in the TBM, and we had, it was quite tight to do touch and goes in the TBM at Dundee. Right, let's take it on a bit more of a cross-country trip, get some altitude underneath it, and then we can have a chat about some other stuff with it. Above 200 feet, flaps up, increase the pitch. Just climb straight out to 1,000 feet and then we'll make a little bit of a turn. I'm glad Sandpatch, your person in the P51, was doing stop and goes, touch and goes in a monstrously powerful tailwheel aircraft could get a bit exciting. There's some horror stories out there of people who've come to grief in aircraft that have got a lot of torque roll effect. Right, we are clear on the right. We're not going to annoy Amy by overflying. Let's turn on to about 315 degrees and we'll take a look at some other bits and pieces. So what I want to do is get the aircraft set up in the climb first of all. So I'm just going to lower the nose, set it to around about 500 feet a minute, click the autopilot in. I'm going to adjust that to 500 because, you know, OCD reasons, and I'm going to say we're going 4,500 feet, sounds good. Remember to arm it, and I'll just leave it in roll mode just now. Turn the pumps off. I'm going to leave the ignition on until we get to cruise altitude. We're going to go up to 4.5, so it might get a little bit chilly out there for our passengers. With the cabin ventilation, we can set the ventilation fan off when we're airborne. If you look on the tail of the aircraft, it's got the air intakes down the back here. The ventilation fan, you can run it on the ground and it pushes air into the cabin, but the little louvers here, they're direct ventilation, so they're always available to the customers. If we want to run the heater, we, I think, are also supposed to run the vent fan. So if you want to put the heater on, vent motor first of all, and then the heater. So in this 500 feet a minute climb, at full power, or more or less full power, it's easily up 140 knots. But look at the fuel flow, it's burning 200 pounds an hour per side. So I'm just going to bring the power back to what we had before. I'm going to come back to about 70%, adjust the RPM to reduce the noise, so come back to about 1800. And then all I'm going to do is reset the torque to keep the temperature around about 720. That gives me a good margin on the yellow line, reasonable torque setting, and it'll climb at 120 knots or so. Let's see what we've got in the flight plan here. I've got nothing on the flight plan. I should probably have loaded something in. Let's say that I want to go from Dundee to a waypoint called Erson. You get spoiled with the not the SR-72. That would be certainly spoiled. You get spoiled with the SR-22 and the TBM with the keyboard, because these interfaces are awful. The thing that I never understand why Garmin did this is they put the enter button here as opposed to on the wheel. You want to just push that to select it. It's the most unnatural thing ever. But there we go. You just have to live with it. 1990s technology. I'll do this, and Collins did it the right way. The centre of the knob is select, so that's what I like to hear. Make sure to take OBS mode off if you've been using OBS mode, otherwise it can get pretty exciting. If I go into my flight plan now and just ask it what would happen if I went direct to Dundee, direct to Erson, course 265, nah, leave it a little bit. What I'm trying to do is to get far enough north of the path control zone. So let's try it one more time. I'm sure there's another way of doing this. I could have used OBS mode again. Ah, that'll do. Let's go. And put it into nav. Yeah, I'm just trying to deal with it here. It's gone. Here we go. So yeah, we're just going to head across to Coll now, which is on the west coast. Again, this is very similar to a trip we did in TBM. With the TBM we went to Glenforsa. We'll maybe go to Glenforsa a little bit later, but we'll go out to Coll first of all. Coll is an airfield that was built with the Islander in mind. About, I don't know, 15 years or so ago now. There was something called the Argyle Air Services Plan, and basically there's a lot of small islands beside Oban, or just off the coast of Oban, and there aren't schools, there aren't secondary schools on the islands, so the kids go to Oban for school, and it was a case of ferry travel or spending the entire term at school. So they set up Argyle Air Services, which take the kids to school. They take the kids from the islands on the Monday or the Sunday, and then back to the islands on the Friday evening, and they operate out of Oban. So Coll and Colonsay were built for the Islander to operate there, or they were built with the Islander in mind, because they're only 500 metres long. I believe a Twin Otter could just about do it, but the Islander is the machine for the job. So there's Coll and Colonsay and Tyree and one other one. Might be Isla, can't remember. Can't wait to see the Q400, Amy. We've got high expectations on the Q400. Cool, just levelling at 4,500 feet. Power, we'll leave the power where it is. Everything seems to be how it should. Everything's looking reasonable. Let's put the ignition off now. We're at cruising altitude. And what we need to do is keep an eye on the fuel tanks. So tip tanks are a bit unusual. Can the Islander do shorter fuels than the Twin Otter? I'd expect the opposite. The differences, I think, are down to how the aircraft are certified. Without getting too technical about it, I believe the Islander is Performance Category B and the Twin Otter is Performance Category A. Now what that means is that a Performance Category A aircraft is an airliner. It has to be able to withstand a failure of the most critical power unit at any point in the flight envelope, essentially a V1 cut. So the aircraft has to be able to continue the entire takeoff profile on one engine. With a Category B aircraft, which the Piston Islander is, and I'm assuming the Turbine Islander is, it doesn't have to be able to survive a V1 cut. It has to be able to survive at a nominated altitude. So the Islander will not climb on one engine if the flaps are out at all. It's got an early flap retraction at 200 feet, simply to facilitate the climb performance on one engine, the certification requirements, if you like. With I think the Twin Otters Category B, but an aircraft of identical performance, if it was certified as a Category A aircraft, it would need a longer runway, or it would need to be able to get to a point with both engines running, have one of the engine fail, and then continue or stop, if that makes sense. So you don't have to consider on an Islander a V1 cut, officially. Now, if you're using it for commercial transport, your insurance company may have other ideas. So that's where the higher speeds come from. If you look at the speeds in the manual, the rotation speeds, they're crazy low. You know, you're talking about 51, 52 knots. Most of the operators use 60 knots, 65 knots in climb. That way it has a bit more energy into the climb, and it's not on the back of the drag curve climbing with the flaps. So if you lose an engine, you can get the flaps up and keep going. But it's very marginal. Same with the Trilander. One engine out, scary. Yeah, you're very much in the marginal category on these piston transports. We get used to aircraft operating like airliners. We believe that all aircraft in commercial service are as safe as airliners. What the Islander has in its favour is those very low speeds. So if it had to make a forced landing immediately after takeoff, it's not carrying a lot of energy into the field. But with twin piston aircraft, a low level power unit failure, the safest thing to do is to close the other throttle and land it straight ahead somewhere. The people that do that end up with an insurance claim, and if they're unlucky, a trip to the hospital. The people that try and save it are the ones that don't make it, because you are so limited in performance. It's not a nice place to be. With the Seneca 2, we get airborne, get the gear up, get the flaps up, and get the speed on, because then you've got options. Yeah, there was also an Islander, I think, that ended up on the beach as well, Sammy. I don't know if that was the same reason. Maybe it was fuel related. So, speaking of fuel, we're now down to 20 gallons in the main tanks, and our tip tanks are still full. So I'll show you this little placard up here. I'll talk about the fuel system because that's fairly interesting. Firstly, the warning: it's a tip tanked aircraft. Tip tanks are to be filled first and used last. Okay. Check the contents. Yeah. Takeoffs and landings are prohibited on main tanks when gauge reads less than 3 gallons above zero. Now, this isn't what the manual says, but this is what the placard says on the real aircraft. Even according to the manual, even if you're using the tip tanks, you still need to have a minimum of 3 gallons in the mains. So how you interpret that in your sim is up to you. But what I do is I work on the basis that I'm still not 100% sure whether that fuel can get to the engine or not. But I know that the main tanks are running. So when I get down to about 15 gallons in each tank, I'm going to switch it onto the tip tanks. And that way I've essentially got my final reserve in these tanks here. And if for whatever reason I can't feed from the tip tank, or there's some contamination in that tank, I can swap over back to the main tank again. Have a look outside. So you're probably wondering, why are you using the main tanks first and not the tip tanks? The tip tanks are all the way out there on the wingtips, obviously. Why would you use the main tanks first? I'll get to the lights in a second, Sam Patch, as well, because that's another interesting quirk on the Islander. What do you think about the fuel sequence? Why are we using fuel inboard first and keeping the fuel outboard? Remember, these are wingtip extensions that the tanks are fitted in. Engines. So it's to do with wing bending relief. Okay. Yeah. If you imagine that this wing here has been extended a little bit to facilitate these, to fit these tanks, right? The wing is longer. It's carrying extra weight, and it's carrying extra weight outboard. But the device that's carrying that weight is a wing. So wouldn't it make sense that the weight is carried by its own wing? If you were to drain this fuel out of this tank, you would have the weight inboard instead. And that means that the wingtip would be empty, and there'd be a bending load around about this point on the wing, and the same on both sides. So by keeping the weight outboard, the mass is being carried, the mass is distributed more evenly along the wing, because the highest stress point on most aircraft is the wing root join. It has to be stressed for flight. Imagine an airliner where the landing gear is inboard. The wing root join has to support the weight of the wings in the ground, and it has to support the lifting force when it's flying. So it has to be stressed to tolerate both directions. You see a 747 barrel down the runway, and as it increases in speed, the wings lift but the fuselage doesn't. That's wing bending. But the 747 can have a lighter wing structure because it's got 4 engines. Because more of the aircraft mass is distributed along the wings. If you were to compare an A330 and an A340, a 2-engine aircraft and a 4-engine aircraft, in theory, the 340 could have a lighter wing structure for flight than a 330, because the 330's got 2 big engines inboard, and the 340's got 4 small engines spread across the wings. So you're doing the same thing in miniature with the Islander. You're doing wing bending relief by keeping the mass outboard, keeping the mass distributed along the engine, along the wing. Now, hey Coop, how's it going? Good to see you. Captain Kitten, I didn't spot you there. Glad you're finding it interesting and not overly dull. There's a lot of nerdy details about this sort of thing, but I just love I love the fact that the aircraft is more complicated than you would initially expect looking at it. I'm just going to check my terrain clearance here. I'm fairly sure 4,500 feet is safe in Scotland. Obviously this is the grid altitude. If you caught the latest PT19 video, this is the off-route altitude. That means that there's terrain down there at 4,400 somewhere in the grid. But on this track we should be good. So, Sandpatch asked about the fuel tank indicator lights. Well, all that stuff I just told you about wing bending relief. When the Islander was first fitted with tip tanks, it had a transfer system rather than a feed system. So when I switch over to tip at the moment, when it goes on to the tip selection, it will feed straight from the tank to the engine. Okay? But when it was first designed, it would transfer the fuel from the tip tanks to the main tanks, and you wouldn't have the advantage of that bending relief. But it did have an automatic system to do that. So this switch here was an automatic switch and a manual switch. Same switch, same position, same lights. When you flick it into automatic mode, not on this aircraft, on the old aircraft, you flick it onto automatic mode and the lights would come on to tell you it was transferring fuel. Off, and it wouldn't be transferring fuel. It would be a manual transfer, which was done with the other switches. This is why you've got this weird arrangement here. It's, start from the beginning, make it do what it's supposed to do. But we've got the lights, when it's on the main tanks, I can switch the lights on and off quite happily. But when it's on the tip tanks, the lights are either bright or dim. You can't have them off. So you explain to me why that wiring is present on the aircraft without referring to something historical about the Islander. Some parts about the aircraft, as I said at the very beginning, some parts of the aircraft are super logical. You know, I love the layout on the overhead here. I think it's great. Fuel selectors are really obvious up there, and then you have this, which is just wedged in there and works in a weird arrangement. Sandpatch, you were talking about the heater. Yeah, so according to the manual, you don't need to run the vent blower when you're in flight with the heater. Everything I could find about operating the aircraft says that the heater, which is at the very back, you see the vents for it there actually, I think you can. It's fairly marginal how it heats. The people at the back will get really hot and the people at the front won't get hot at all. So any extra assistance you can give it with the vent blower is typically useful. You must run the vent blower on the ground if you've got the heater on, and also you must, if you switch off the heater, you must run the vent blower or leave the vent blower running for a minute or so to get rid of any fuel vapours that would be otherwise just hanging around the rear of the aircraft. So, just another weird thing. It's a fuel burning heater as well, so it burns the fuel from the right tank if I remember correctly. So you wouldn't run the heater unless you really needed to. Looks a bit snowy on the ground, so what temperature is it outside? 10 degrees. We probably want a little bit of heat now. But it does have a thermostatic cutout. If it gets too hot, it'll isolate itself. It's regulated up here. But I tend to work on the basis that... So what I normally do in the sim, and I don't know if it's real life, I'm desperately trying to persuade my wife that going to get an Islander, going to revalidate my multi-engine rating on an Islander is a good thing to do, good investment for the future. She's not buying into it. But I tend to run the vent blower whenever the heat is on, and I'll run the vent blower on the ground until the fuel pumps are selected off. So if I'm not running the heater, the vent blower is on when the fuel pumps are on, and the vent blower is off when the fuel pumps are off. So off for flight, on for approach, landing and takeoff. Don't know if that works, just try and keep it straightforward. For me, the thing about flying simulated aircraft is it's not so much about the procedures being exactly correct. It's more about making sure that you can repeat the procedures you decide to use on a regular basis. Okay? So if you're trying to teach yourself standard operating procedures, even on an aircraft like the A320, the procedures vary from one operator to another. One airline will have different procedures to another airline. That doesn't mean either airline is right or wrong, it just means they're different. So similarly, if an operator of the Islander were to choose a different manner of operation, it doesn't necessarily make it right or wrong. As a pilot, you just have to be able to demonstrate you can do that reliably and repeatedly. So if an aircraft add-on for X-Plane comes with a really good manual, like the TorqueSim one does, I'll just try and work within the guidance of that manual, because there's no consequence of doing it any differently. You know, I don't fly an Islander, so getting it wrong, you know, I can unlearn things like that if I ever find myself in that situation. But it's all about repetition, if you like. Can you stick to your own SOPs from flight to flight? Well, that makes sense. That's just my view on it anyway. Does everybody know with Avatab you can move it around here? If we put the cursor up here, we can move it left and right, which is pretty useful. And on the side we can move it forwards and backwards, just to put it somewhere you really want it. Do I miss having real weather to add some emotion to the flights? Not really, Alec. I don't find the wind effects in X-Plane to be very good at all. I prefer to fly with wind off, simply because it just doesn't feel the way it should. Also, when you're dealing with turbulence on an aircraft that you're sitting in, you know that you've entered a patch of turbulence because you feel it. So if you're looking at the GPS or you're doing something heads down just for a second and you go through a thermal, you feel it straight away and you look up and you fix it. But that's a sensation you just don't have in the sim. So for me, weather injection into the X-Plane system takes away a little bit of immersion, because the aircraft will go and do something that I wasn't expecting it to do without it giving me any feedback or any input whatsoever. The clouds, you know, I don't mind the clouds. I don't deliberately set off to fly on cloudy days. You know, maybe it's a different perspective, but if you gave me control of the real world weather outside, I mean, tonight's a miserable night. It's cold, it's rainy, it's windy. I wouldn't want to go flying on a night like this unless I was paid to do it, and even been paid to do it. You don't necessarily want to go and do it on a miserable night. If you had a button you could click to make it enjoyable, you'd click that button every day. So I kind of do in the sim. I'll put clouds on for realism. The clouds change the lighting nicely. I'll set the visibility distance to apply a haze layer in the distance if I want. Even things like the pressure changes. Pressure changes are more often than not given to you by air traffic, and if you're not flying online, you just don't have that. So here we are, down to about 15 gallons. What I'll do is change the fuel tanks over to the tip tanks. So these are electrically signalled. I don't think you need to run the pumps, but I'm going to run the pump just to be sure. So flick the switch, it goes on to tip tank. I'm going to make sure that the fuel low pressure warning light doesn't come on. Pump off again. All is good. I'll just leave it for 30 seconds or so, just to make sure that there isn't water or something else in that fuel tank. Obviously we've checked it, but you never know. When all is well, we'll change the other tank over. So pump on, change tanks, check for low pressure, pump off. So what I've got left in the main tanks now is like a final reserve. If I'm getting very low on the tip tanks, I can go back and comfortably start feeding off the main tanks again. Excellent. So in my soaring video, in the K21, we kind of soared along the south side of this ridge here. Oban's down here, and this is Mull ahead of us. Just I can't stop looking at the outside of the airplane. As I said before, I can't put my finger on every detail that they've changed. I think it's a whole lot of little changes that have made a huge difference on the outside, but it just looks fantastic. Absolutely brilliant. There's a military version which has got a wire antenna, it's got a radar nose, and it's got a flare pod on the right hand side as well, just to add some visual differences. It doesn't change the cabin, it's not a mission fit in the cabin, but it makes the visual model look a little bit different. So if you've got military paints or the paints for the early Defenders, it will go nicely on the military model. And this is the 1982 vintage of this livery. The modern livery of Oscar Hotel here looks very faded, but this one is shiny and new. It looks awesome. It's almost like a BOAC livery. It's almost like the same colours as BOAC, except she's got a white belly rather than a blue. So who's bought the aircraft already? Who in the chat is flying along on their Islander at the same time? Hey Ulrich, how's it going? The P2012, is that the airliner one, Yearning? I'm having super fun with it, Ulrich. I don't know how much of the stream you've caught, but it is just, I love it. It's so immersive. it takes me back to flying the old Flight Sim 2002 Islanders. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying your textures of 2002. It takes me back to the feeling of flying that aircraft, the feeling of actually going exploring somewhere in an aircraft that it felt like I had some connection with. And I think you've recreated that perfectly in this model. It's super fun. I'm trying to remember now, Yearning, what the P2012 looks like. That's the 12-seat high-wing twin 0540 Technam, like a big 2006. Yeah, I've not been close to a Technam aircraft for a while. I would be surprised if they were able to construct something with the longevity of the Islander. I believe for a metal airframe, I don't think it may not have a stress fatigue life. It's very solidly built. As I said, the only weak points on the aircraft are the landing gear. If you look at the landing gear from the front, they are quite spindly in side load, so you've got to make sure you get any drift off on a crosswind landing, and it's got phenomenal crosswind capability. But otherwise, you can put some side load on it, and if you have a firm landing, a very firm landing with the Islander, you can cause spar damage because there's a lot of lever moment on this gear as well. So if you were to run it into a rut and it was to push the wheel back, it would essentially destroy the side of the wing. So the lever moment is fairly significant. But the Islander has been incredibly robust in service. There used to be photos on the Fair Isle website of an Islander that had a gear collapse on Fair Isle, and the Islander can self-support. Another Islander in the same fleet can deliver pretty much any part for the Islander. So it can take engines. The engines will fit in the fuselage of an Islander. The tailplane, the elevator, the rudder, the fin will fit inside the fuselage on an Islander. The only thing that you cannot replace on an Islander using an Islander is the main spar and the fuselage. And to be honest, if you've damaged the spar or the fuselage, it's probably a write-off anyway. So I don't know whether the Technam will be able to deliver the same level of resilience, the same longevity as this thing has. It reminds me of an old Land Rover. You know, probably needs a bit of care and maintenance now and then, but it will keep on going if you look after it right. Sweet piston skills on Linux. Yeah, I think you'll enjoy it, Amy. When you go from turboprop flying or turbine flying to piston flying, you spend a lot of time operating the levers down here that you don't realise how much... yeah, Defender as well, Pilsner. You don't realise how much time you spend managing the engines. It's one of the things that's fairly easy to catch yourself out with in the sim. So as I said, I only have a hardware throttle. I don't have any hardware controls for the levers. I've got the RPM back ever so slightly, and when I was first testing it, I found I did an approach and a touch and go with the condition levers back. Now in the real thing, you would obviously remember to push them forward, because even if you land with them in the back position, as you push the power levers forward, as your hand's on this, it'll naturally feel those condition levers as well. And it's the same with the mixture of the prop on a piston aircraft, that rather than grabbing it with a fist, you would kind of push the levers with an open hand, and that way you get all of them. So things like if you've got carb heat as well, you just naturally feel that something's out of place, and it's harder to get that sensation in the sim. So it kind of drills in proper engine management across the board. You part-owned a Defender, Pilsner. I don't know if anybody's ever fully owned a Defender. They tend to come in kit form, as I remember. Even if they weren't in kit form when they left the dealer, they're in kit form by the time they got on your driveway. So we're flying over Loch Linney at the moment. This is, I mean to look up the name of this island. It's on here. I think it's Lismore. I'm not 100% sure. Of course, they wouldn't actually name the island on the thing. Ladies Rock Lighthouse, Lismore. Lismore's this one here. Achnacoich? Yeah, it's called that. Did your Defender venture much outside of Surrey, Pilsner, with the winch and the roof rack? Just curious. I would hope so. I'd hope with a winch at least you got somewhere hilly. So yeah, this is a very scenic part of the world. If you're flying over here, this is the Great Glen, a geographic fault that runs northwest to southeast Scotland. Loch Ness is up here. This is Loch Linney, it's a sea loch. Fort William is up here, and this is Ben Nevis. This lump here. Hampshire, West Sussex, the usual. Yeah, you need four-wheel drive in Hampshire for sure. I mean, quite hypocritical. I used to own a Freelander as well. It's not quite the same. Still a four-wheel drive, but much lower now. But it's, speaking about the Land Rovers, you know, it feels the same sort of construction, you know, that what it does, that the key parts of the aircraft and the key parts of those cars, they work very well for what they're designed to do. You then have some odd design decisions like the external supply switch here on the Islander, the odd fuel tank arrangement, and the fact on a Land Rover Defender you can't drive it without the driver's window down unless you don't have an elbow. So we're going to go out to Coll, which is one of the small isles, another 30 odd miles away, and then if we've got time we'll do a quick shutdown on the ground, fire it back up again, come back to Glenforsa airfield, which is down here, and then we'll fly back to Oban, which is just behind us. So you get to see a couple of shutdowns, a couple of landings, everything else. Is there anything else anybody would like to see on the aircraft at the moment? If you're thinking about buying it, is there anything I can show you on it? Do you have any questions I can try my best to answer for you? Or Sandpatch can answer, because he's got the manual there. He's going to be my go-to for things about the island. What do we think about the fuel burn on this aircraft? Notice first of all the fuel flow is calibrated in pounds per hour, so we're burning what, about 150, 160 pounds per engine per hour, and the tanks are calibrated in gallons. She's thirsty for sure, Totorico. So gallons, obviously it's a liquid volume, so the tank's measured in volume, but the engine burns mass rather than volume. Just one of the things that most other aircraft manufacturers hide you from by measuring fuel as the weight or measuring your fuel flow as the volume. But you know, it keeps pilots on their toes, as Toto says. Can anybody remember the calculation? I think it's 6.7 from memory for turbine fuel. A Jet A1 it would be 6.7 pounds per gallon, I think. So if we are burning, I have to get a calculator. We are burning, what, 300 divided by 6.7. 44 gallons an hour, doing 140 knots. So the Piston uses about half the fuel for a similar-ish sort of speed. We can go faster. I tried it earlier and I was burning nearly 70 gallons an hour to get 160 knots indicated. So cruising along at 140 with the props back a little bit, make it a bit quieter, goes quite well. So is everybody in the chat, are you all familiar with the 3 degrees rule of thumb, which is 5 times the ground speed or half the ground speed, put a 0 on the end of it? we're doing 150 odd knots at the moment, so that would be for a 3-degree flight path 750 feet a minute, and that's about 3 miles per 1,000 feet. One of the things you can do to make life easier in Islander is just descend at 500 feet a minute and around about 140 knots, and then you need 5 miles per 1,000 feet. It's a third of the ground speed is 5 miles per 1,000 feet. So we've got 26 miles to go to the airfield. I've got about 4,000 feet to lose, so we'll descend at approximately 20 miles out, take it from there. Install the GTN in the panel? No. Well, you've got VNAV in this. Should we have a laugh and see what this calculates? See if I can remember how to do this. I want to be at 1,500 feet MSL, and I want to be there 3 miles before GL, and I want to do 500 feet a minute, 2 minutes. I didn't cross-fill. I never bother cross-filling. I actually just usually leave this one in the nearest airspace display to make sure I'm not busting airspace. Yeah, it's the default 530, 430, the X-Plane 530, 430 don't annoy me quite as much as the G1000. It's simply because you've got a lower expectation of the capability in the 530. It does almost everything it's supposed to do, it just sometimes gets itself quite lost. Put it into heading and then you're good to go. Yeah, the default low rate, I think with the TBM from memory, if you're asking it to do more than 2,000 feet a minute, it doesn't calculate that. So above 400 knots, it's not great. 400 knots ground speed. Of course, with the TBM, you get higher descent rates at lower speeds because of the props. So I'm about to start the descent from my cruise altitude. Does anybody know anything about the ignition? Maybe Sandpatch or Toto, you might know. I'm just using the ignition as if using ignition with the fuel pumps. Anytime I'm going to make any power changes, reduce power settings, I have the ignition on. Let's go down to 1,500 feet, so I'll stick it into vertical speed mode, go nose down, make a power reduction, and remember to push the arm button. To be honest, it's easier to fly this aircraft with the autopilot off for most of the things you want to do with it. Would you not use the ignition, Toto? You see, I don't have to worry about these things on a day-to-day basis. You put the flaps out, you put the anti-ice on, the ignition comes on by itself. So it's fairly straightforward. The only time we have to put the ignition on manually is flight in heavy rain. You just turn the starter to the ignition start position and you get heavy rain on the 320. You've got the igniters ready to go. Yeah, they don't have a bypass. Is it similar, Ulrich, to the general arrangement? It's obviously a reverse flow engine like the PT6. So I'm guessing this will be a cooler up here, oil cooler or something. Air intake on the front and reverse flow like the PT6. Ah, okay. Reverse flow with the compressor at the front, not the back. That's interesting. No bypass. Interesting. When I was looking for the docks for this engine, I found it was installed in a lot of helicopters, and it was also used in the no separator. No, that's fine. Does MD know what a Soloy turbo conversion on a Cessna 206 looks like? Has MD seen a turbine conversion on a Cessna 206? I believe it's the same engine, the same family of engines as the Islander has that's fitted to that aircraft. The Cessna's not a pretty aircraft with a turbine. Oh really? You love it? Oh my goodness, no, I don't like that. It's not a... Yeah, maybe it's an acquired taste. So we are 14 miles out at 3,000 feet, descending nicely. What I'm going to do is, I'm just going to disable the nav mode for the moment. It's going into roll. And what I'm going to do is use the OBS on the system here. So flick it into OBS mode, and then I'll turn my pointer around to 200. Okay, so I've still got distance to the waypoint, still up here. I've also got the cross-track distance. If I was trying to establish on the base leg, try and establish downwind or midfield join, this helps out. And it gives me a visual reminder of where I'm supposed to be pointing for the runway as well. That kind of makes sense, Toto and Ulrich. You can kind of imagine the exhausts on top of the cabin on a helicopter. Yeah, that makes sense. Right, for the field approach checks, I'm going to switch the heater off because there are reasons. And as I said, I've been running it so that with the fuel pump on, the cabin ventilators on, such that when we shut down on the ground or when we're taxiing in on the ground, our lovely customers here obviously still have some fresh air available to them, because you don't want them to get upset, especially these guys down the back. They don't really look like they're enjoying their flight. This guy is quite unhappy. Don't know what it is. I mean, maybe it's the heater, maybe he's too hot now. Just, he's got a zip. And you've got noise cancelling headsets, for goodness sake. It should be nice back there. They're probably the best 3D model people I've ever seen in a sim. I recognise the girl down the back from the Cirrus as well. They're really nice. What you don't want to do is to move your view across, because if you clip inside, that's kind of disturbing, isn't it? Just a little bit. Anyway, I'll concentrate on flying now. We're 8 miles away at 2,000 feet, so I'm a touch higher than expected. But that's okay. As I said, we can be fairly carefree with the RPM. With the power lever handling, so making a big power reduction won't cause any issues with this aircraft. If you're flying the piston engine, it's not a good idea. So because I've got OBS mode here, I've got a magenta line to aim for, which airline pilots love magenta lines. Also, I can see that I'm doing a 90 degree, so I'm basically going to join on base leg here. If we zoom forward, there's an island here, there's a couple of lakes there, and the airfield's here. So if I just fly towards the gap in those islands here, and then turn right a bit and turn left, that should hopefully do us. See how it works. Approach briefing complete. Shortest brief ever. The turbine engine made a huge difference in helicopters, Toto. I can't remember the name, 1500 feet. I'm just going to take the autopilot out. I can't remember the proper Sikorsky name for it. I know it as the Wessex, and the predecessor to the Wessex, can't remember its name. But they originally had, I want to say Wright Cyclones. They had big radial engines out at the front. And the amount of cabin space that was taken up with the engine is phenomenal. Right, I'm going to bring the power back. We'll start slowing down. I'll reset my pitch attitude. So when we bring the power off, we've obviously got to keep an eye on the trim. Chickasaw, that's the one. So coming in over the coast about 1,000 feet or so, just increase the power ever so slightly, and I'll adjust the trim. We'll let the speed start to wash off slowly. So remember what I said about making sure the engines are spooled up. It's the one place where the turbine demands a little bit more attention than the piston, in that you can't really do a low save with this aircraft. If your sink rate is too high close to the ground, it's going to catch you out. If you're trying to arrest the rate of descent, just keep the power on and go around, live to fight another day. I'm going to bring the first stage of flaps out, and I'm going to bring the props up. So flaps to take off, props forward. Just hold that pitch trim, and then as it slows down, I'm back to neutral trim again. Can anybody see the airfield yet? I think I know where it is. Start descending. So flaps, fuel sufficient, brakes off, undercarriage fixed. Here's the runway here. So this house here looks like a good aiming point. It can be unforgiving if you chop the power. The propellers obviously will blank off some airflow over the wings and produce a lot of drag as well, so power to the flare kind of helps. Yep, 65 on the blue line, Ulrich across the board. Final stage of flaps. I'll take the flaps as a roll, that'll offset some of the lift vector. Don't need anywhere near that rate of bank here. Try and just judge it. So I've got a lovely lead-in tree line here, which sort of works. Make sure I'm in trim on speed. Remember, if you're having trouble with your approach profile, you're probably not trimming it, because once you're in trim for the speed and the power, all should be well. So flaps full, props up. So this is 500 meters or so, and as I said, this runway was built with islanders in mind. Centerline would be nice. There's a touch more adverse yaw on this aircraft than the Piston. I wonder if that's due to the longer wings. So I see my torque is spooled up, but we've got to look at the far end of the runway. It's a narrow runway as well. Back traverse. And then we'll come into beta, and that's us basically down at taxiing speed with only a slight pressure on the brake at the end. Leaving the runway, I'll take the ignition off, and just slow down a little bit, fuel pumps off, and the flaps up, and we'll have the landing lights and the P2 off. Excellent. There's a bit of a low nose attitude on touchdown, but you know, we're here. With these short runways, it's just about putting the aircraft down where you want it and making that final descent the way you want it to be. With bigger airliners, we talk about stabilised approach criteria, basically keeping the aircraft stable on the profile on speed from 1,000 feet all the way down. That's a bit gratuitous in an aircraft like the Islander. That being said, if you're fighting it below 250 feet, the chances are you started off in the wrong place. So if there's any doubt, go around, live to fight another day. Alright, just come to a halt on the brakes. I'll take it out of beta, and I'll set the parking brake. Double check we've got everything selected off up there. That's fine. So coming in here, transponder, it'll go off anyway. I guess out of politeness we should probably put it to standby. And then what we'll do is we'll switch the avionics off. Do we need to switch generators off? Probably not. Doesn't do any harm. Generators off. Condition levers, both together. All the way to cut off. Whilst they're spilling down, I'll reset the trim so that I don't forget about it for the next time. Once the props have stopped, more or less, we are good to switch off the beacon, passenger notices, the cabin lights, switch off that vent blower, and we'll switch off the battery just for a minute or two, and we'll open it up on the outside. We'll have a look around the outside. It may be a bathroom break as well. We'll see how it goes. Open doors. There we go. Yeah, exactly, Ulrich. Much better to put it down than drift down the runway. So it's really when you get on the outside, when you get close up to it on the outside, you can see how nice the aircraft looks. As I said, on the Piston aircraft, I love it. On this one, it's even better. It's almost like a skeletal animation on the brake lines. If you do a replay, you can see the animation on the brake lines. That's really nice. We've got the baggage hold down the back, and even simple things. The texturing on the tail, the way it reflects the light is just amazing. And I'm running, for those of you that are not familiar, this is a very old PC. It is an i5 2500K. i5 2500K. It's running a 1060 GTX with 6 gigs. I'm getting 70 frames a second with a computer that's 9 years old and a GPU that's about 4 years old. It's it's fairly light on the frames. It works nicely and it's beautifully textured. So just give it a couple of minutes and fire it back up. I've got a quick bathroom break, guys. If you do have any questions, pop them in the chat and I'll be back with you in a couple of minutes. Alright folks, back with you. So what do you think of it so far? Those of you that haven't bought it, those of you that don't really know whether you want an Islander or not, what do you think about the airplane? I can't, you just bought it, Sandpatch? Awesome. I've not found an angle that an Islander looks bad from. The Trilander, it's maybe not so much. An Islander looks good from every angle. Yeah, military 3D model on the outside. Yeah, it's a very fair price. My opinion is it's a fair price. The pack, if you imagine buying the Piston and the turbine together, you're paying about the same as you would for the SR22. And the SR22, you've got two different engine options on the aircraft, which makes a big difference because they're quite different aircraft. And if you consider the Islander a pack like that, you're getting really good value for money because these are two completely different models. I've seen some questions about the system's fidelity on aircraft like this, and I'm usually the #1 person to really want custom systems everywhere. The Islander, it doesn't seem like it's using default technology for a lot of stuff because the immersion is right there. I find it a very immersive aircraft to operate. I think it's just because it's very hands-on machine. But I can spend, I mean, this is the last beta product that I got. I installed it at 1 AM this morning, and I've been doing a little bit of testing with it. But if we have a look at the Hobbs meter, bearing in mind it reset when you install the beta, that's how much I enjoy this aircraft. It's super fun. And as I said, I'm usually a big proponent for fully simulated, full realism. The Islander doesn't feel like any less of an aircraft. It's fantastic. Let's close all the doors and get it fired up again. Yeah, so some of the SR-22 stuff, like the engines, that would be nice to have. But it's, I don't know, it doesn't, it's never been an issue, Sandpatch. I've never found it even remotely frustrating. I don't think about it when I'm flying it. So just double check. Obviously the fuel's been left on. We don't need to change the tanks on the first flight of the day. We don't need, on the second flight of the day, we don't need to check the fuel feed. So everything on the top panel is correct. Coming down here, nav lights are ready to go. Everything else is off condition, and all the circuit breakers. Just double check I didn't inadvertently scroll wheel one of the circuit breakers. No, we're good. What's the point of the crash bar? Exactly that. If you've got them all on and you want them off, you just push the button and they all go off. With any piston aircraft, Sandpatch, for the most part, if you have a unexpected situation on the ground, if you just remember throttle, mixture, fuel, mags, master. So throttle, mixture, fuel, mags, master, you can safe the aircraft. And because you've got imagine a Piper Warrior, you've got a combined master battery switch. Well, you've got 3 generators on here, so you've got the crash bar to do the same job. Yeah, Ulrich, exactly. It's I don't find I love the engine simulation in the Cirrus. I don't find not having it to be it doesn't detract for me from the aircraft at all. Right, so the battery's on. Let me concentrate on what I'm supposed to be doing. What am I actually doing? I'm starting the engines. So cabin lights, passenger notices, beacon on for the people on the ground, and I'll just double check I didn't see it, brakes on. Right, throttle and condition. So we are going to put the switch on that I always forget, external supply. I'm going to start the right engine first. I'm going to push that button there. Yeah, the doors are closed. So, starting the engines again, it is fuel pump on, ignition on, start. We've got rotation, gas generator is coming up. I will bring it forward to the min detent. So it's 14% minimum on the gas gen before you apply fuel. Keep an eye on the turbine temperature. Keep an eye on the gas generator acceleration. Once we get to 50%, we can switch that back off again. And it should spill up. Just waiting for it to stabilize. I think in real life this would be sprung loaded. I think you'd have to hold it, but obviously clicking it over on the sim is fairly useful. Right, next one, we are going to do the same thing again. So fuel pump on, ignition on, check we are clear, start left. Gas generators above 14%, ignition coming up. Thanks for joining us, Yearning. Hope you enjoyed the stream, and hope you'll join us again soon. Take care. Yeah, it's a good choice, Ulrich. It would just be a bit of a faff if you had to do a binding for the start. Some aircraft you've got to bind the start switch because they are spring loaded, and that annoys me. So I like that. Okay, temperature's coming up. Both props are there, so bring the condition up. And what we'll do is we'll check the gens as well. So we've got battery discharge and it's showing 25 volts, 24, 25. That's a surefire sign it's battery only. Put the right one on. See, it comes up to about 27, 28 and it's charging. Go to the left one, the left on, it comes up as well. We've got 10 amps there. Just double check the battery now, and the battery is charging. Notice when it's on battery it shows the higher voltage indicating it's charging as well. So having checked the gens, we'll turn off the start isolate, put the avionics on. While the avionics are spinning up, one check on the compass again, make sure the compass system does what it's supposed to do. It goes one way, that works, goes the other way, goes back to centre. Also 310 will fix the gyro on this side because our FO isn't doing anything today. And having done that, I should probably put the transponder on alt now. I don't know if you've got to do a feather check or exercise the props. I think you probably do, so we probably grab them both and come back to the min, make sure they both move simultaneously. And back, we'll do it a couple of times. And back, all is good. Right, we are probably ready to taxi off. We're going to go over to, how long's the stream been going on for just now? Oh, is it a good time to fly over to Glenforsa and then maybe on to Oban, another 20-25 minutes or so? We'll just do a taxi back at Glenforsa, we'll not shut it down. Right, we're clear on the left side, clear on the right side. There's something I'm forgetting. What am I forgetting? Let me just double check. No. Oh, flight control check, that's the one. Put the yoke up, it usually reminds me. Just double check that I haven't done anything silly with my joystick. And off we go. So again, put it into beta for those that missed the start. I'm using simple hardware, just a throttle axis. I have to put it into reverse first, and then push the beta button, and then I've got beta range. And you'd normally use beta range for taxiing. Beta gives you direct control of the propeller blade pitch, so it's more precise for ground movement. So clear right, clear left, no taxi lights, brakes off, and we're underway. So we're going to basically backtrack the runway. As we're taxiing out, if there's no debris on the ground, I'll select the flaps, we'll go all the way to down. Make sure they extend fully and then back to takeoff. You'll get things sandpatch like I found that you can trip the generators if you're not careful. With the prop anti-ice you can trip the generators that way. I don't know, that for me failure systems have got to be done right, they've got to be done fully. I don't like a simple parameter being enough to kill your engine. I like long-term wear. For me, the way the TBM does it is very good. I've seen some other models that just get frustrating, to be quite honest. I was too busy talking, I didn't put the vent blower on for our poor customers. Oh dear. Right, so bring the prop pitch, I'll basically bring all the way back to beta. So not touching the brakes at all, just controlling the motion of the aircraft with the beta range. One of the real advantages of the turbine. And take it out of beta, get on the centre line. And as I said at Dundee, because we've got a short runway now, I'm going to run it on the brakes. I should probably have actually used the whole runway. But before we go, just double check, I've got the ignition on, the fuel pumps on, we've got switches set correctly, and the props are full throttle, the condition transponders on, we're good to go. Right, so on we go. I've got two different buttons, one for max and one for regular brake, so I just need to swap fingers there. There we go, brakes released, and again we should be able to rotate around about 60 knots or so. You can haul it off the ground earlier. but remember you've got that climb gradient stuff to worry about as well. There's 50, 55, I'll rotate. 50 feet over the end, yep, just about. We're at very high weight as well, all the people on board. So this would be a kind of Sunday evening flight out of Coll here, taking the school kids across to Oban for the weekend school. Above 200 feet, flaps up, increase the pitch attitude and let the aircraft accelerate. There's no terrain, so I'll start a gentle turn towards the destination. Yeah, those sort of random failures, Pilsner, I don't know what to make of those. I don't mind it as long as it is on a realistic timeline. I don't want every flight to have a failure simply to demonstrate that the developers have produced a failure system. That's not fun at all. It doesn't add anything to me, for me. Above 1,000 feet, I'm going to lower the nose. I'm going to adjust the trim. So about 5 degrees pitch, and as I said, I'll bring the power back a little bit. I'll bring the props back just for the noise in the cabin, and then I'll reset the torque so it's about 720 degrees, and then we'll aim for about 500 feet a minute. We'll go up to about 2,000 feet in this one. Fuel pumps can go off and the cabin blower can go off, reduces some noise. Yeah, MTBF failures, I don't want to name specific developers, but some aircraft, if they were that unreliable, you just wouldn't fly them, you know, you'd sell it, quite simply. If it was your aircraft, you'd sell it rather than go fly it. So it's the island of Mull ahead of us. There's a lovely beach around about here. I think we flew over it. It's called Calgary, as in same place in Canada. The whole thing about the Islander for me, and I think why I enjoy it so much, is just doing flights like this that you're down in the scenery, you're not 36,000 feet above the scenery. It just seems like a lot of fun. I'm fairly sure real Islander pilots are very hard working. Their job is almost certainly a lot harder than mine on most days. But from a sim perspective, it just seems like a fantastic way to spend your time. We'll switch off the ignition, keep Totorico happy, so everything is set appropriately. It's a sort of aircraft that I would love to spend my retirement flying around, I think. Yeah, the Sound of Mull, that's correct. So we're going to fly down the Sound of Mull towards Oban, but we're going to do a stop and taxi back at Glenforsa as well, just for fun. Trims nicely for hands-off flying. You don't need the autopilot. You can fly the whole thing without the autopilot. The autopilot in the GNS 530, they've got some interesting features, but you know, all general aviation autopilots have got some interesting features, so you can work with them. Yeah, that's right, Sam Patch, the grass runway on the TBM. That's same place. So it was very tight in the TBM. If I was in that top percentage and I owned a TBM, I may not take it to Glenforsa. I know somebody with a Piper Warrior that wrote off the engine and prop at Glenforsa because the nose gear went down a rabbit hole, and you don't want to do that with a TBM. Does it not roll like the Piston version? How do you mean, Jono? There's one oddity about the turbine compared to the Piston. Now, I think I'm correct in saying this, the Pistons get counter-rotating props, so they always turn in the way, so the left one turns that way and the right one turns that way. and the reason for that is the downgoing blade produces slightly more power at high angle of attack. So on the piston, the left-hand engine is the critical engine. If you shut down the left-hand engine, your thrust is out here, your thrust line is out here, whereas if you shut down the right-hand engine, your thrust line is here. So the thrust line offset is greater. On this one, the thrust line offset is greater with the left engine shut down because the propellers go the same way, whereas on the piston the thrust line is always inboard because they counter-rotate. That wasn't very well explained, sorry. It seems more stable in roll. Would a turbine engine have less mechanical torque reaction? I don't know. Oh, I thought they were handed, Ulrich. Maybe I'm confusing it with something else. I do tend to put 2 and 2 together and remember 15 other aircraft. We were talking about mechanical torque, Totorico. Jono was asking the piston aircraft, when it's in the cruise, you need to either hold a little bit of aileron or use aileron trim on your joystick, even with the ball in the middle sometimes, whereas this aircraft doesn't seem to have that. To be honest, I think it's just an evolution of the flight model, Jono. I think this one is more stable to fly. It could be because it's got slightly longer wings, it could be just an evolution of the flight model. No, so on the turbine, Toto, they are definitely not handed. We were talking about maybe the piston aircraft has got handed props. I know the Seneca is handed, and the A400 has got weird counter-rotating props. They're just strange, it looks odd, makes a funny noise. Ulrich, what I've noticed with this one is it's much better on one engine. Not to say the performance is better on one engine, because it's still, the piston's acceptable, but it feels more natural on one engine. The piston can kind of run out a little bit of lateral control if you shut down one engine, whereas this one is much more sorted. If anybody's got the engine codes for the BN2, it'll tell you. It should be a IO. No, it's not. It's carb. It's an 0540, and if it's an 0540L, that's the counter rotation version. But maybe you're right. Maybe they all go the same way. Or honestly, can't remember now. Oh, sweet. Good to hear. So, Jono, this has basically been me just messing around with the stick in the center position. What you're seeing me is flying it within the tolerances of my joystick spring. The Islander was reportedly heavy to fly, heavy and roll, and I think this model captures that. Right, let's get ready for the approach. We'll put the ignition on. Have the fuel pumps on, check my fuel endurance. We've still got enough. Right, start bringing the power off. So Glenforsa is beyond that hill here, and maybe a little bit on the high side. So if we end up high, we'll just do a little tour around the bay and then we'll come back in. So I've got the power all the way off. I'm going to adjust the pitch to maintain 500 feet a minute, and we'll come back to about 100 knots indicated. So the P-38 Lightning is interesting. It's got counter rotating props, but they go out the way, so its asymmetric effects are severe, and it's got tiny rudders as well. but the props are handed that way to minimise, I think it was a vibration issue over the tailplane on the booms, so their props rotate completely the wrong way. I don't know what its VMCA speed is, but it must be phenomenal. Yeah, I can believe that, Sandpatch. If you look at photos of videos of a Lockheed Electra when it's on a smoky departure, look at the smoke trails, you can see a big difference on the number 1 engine versus the number 4 engine because of the effect of the prop airflow and the flaps. So the flaps only cover half the prop airflow on the number 1 and the number 4, and you can see it as a very distinct difference in the smoke trails. So I'll fly down this this roadway here. If you're coming into Glenforsa to land on the easterly runway, and you're coming down the Sound of Mull, as we did in the TBM video, you'd fly north of this island here, and then turn around over this bay and turn in. We're just going to do a little weave, and we'll kind of turn the corner and land. Reverse gearbox, yeah, that makes sense. I can't imagine them building 2 completely different engines for the 400. That would be a nightmare if you had one go down route and you had to get a particular engine shipped out. You'd have to carry twice as many spares. So I'm going to bring the props up. As I said, I'm only bringing the props back for cabin noise related reasons and fuel burn. You can cruise with the props all the way forward as much as you want. Can MD see the airfield yet? This has unfortunately been affected by my terrain mesh thing as well. So the runway is usable, the apron isn't really usable at the moment. Need to have a look at that. So we'd normally come in from the left here and then trundle round. Good way of doing this is just to follow the road. There's the first stage of flaps. I'll just hold against the trim until the speed bleeds off. So flaps out, props up, brakes off. Final stage of flaps. And again, this is really long runway for the Islander. You've seen Coll was fairly short. Glenforsa is long enough, but there's that lack of power can cause you to lose that. You get a great rate of descent building up fairly quickly. So keep an eye on that power all the way through. And look at the far end of the runway. Don't look at the runway coming towards you. Look at the far end. Anywhere before the parallel or the taxiway would be fine. Power on until we get to the flare. Hold the nose up. Down she goes. Put it into beta. I'll keep some weight off the nose if we can. And then I'll put it into max reverse. Back to beta. We'll just do a quick taxi back and then we'll get airborne. So I'll leave everything where it is, not bother with the lights, the pitot heater, any of that stuff. I don't think we can taxi on grass without coming out of beta. Just an X-plane thing. Oh, we'll trundle back. So my apron that was lovely and flat when we brought the TBM here, it seems to have... there's been some kind of seismic event at Glenforsa. That's not a political commentary. Set the trim back where it needs to be. I saw that, Ulrich. There was an accident report I was reading where the aircraft was noted as not having full reverse. That's possibly because it doesn't have that separator as well that you mentioned. It's much more likely to have a FOD event. Yeah. The thing is, on the piston, you don't really need it, and it's not carrying any more energy. It's remarkable. They've made a heavier aircraft, but given it enough wings so it flies at basically the same speeds. Yeah, that's exactly right, Amy. You can get basically FOD picked up and sucked in the engine, which is, you know, why the PT6 has got that separator. And also the recommendation not to come out of max reverse, not to use max reverse. And if you are using any reverse, come out of it at a higher speed. Come out of it when you still have forward motion. Did I ever tell you the story, Toto, about the time I got stuck on the grass? I was in a tailwheel aircraft and we ended up somewhere we shouldn't really have been on the airfield, and it just wouldn't move. We had to shut down, get out, fix it from there. Anyway, stories for another day. All the switches are set. We've got ignition, I've got the flaps to reset, that'll be the one. Fuel pumps are on, and everything else looks good. Should we go to Oban and then we'll call it quits? So it's a long runway, I'm not going to hold it against the brakes. See, one of the differences compared to the TBM video is although the apron has been destroyed, it has removed the trees. Let's put the panel lights on so you can see the awesome lighting, because that's way better on this one than the Piston version. How cool is that? Right, let's go one final time with enthusiasm. Oh, let's get that nose gear straight, huh? Off we go, full power. Man, I love this thing. 40 knots, cross-checked. 50, 55, 60. So pitch just to the horizons on top of the coaming there, about 10 degrees. Checking the rudder if we need it. 70 knots is fine. Above 200 feet, flaps up, adjust the pitch to offset the sink, and just hold it on that 10-degree line. Hopefully she'll accelerate. And because we're only going to Oban, we'll just go up to 1500 feet and then fly along. We'll make a slight power reduction, just keep an eye on those temps, but we'll leave the props where they are. You can see the difference on the fuel flow. We're having the props at 2030. What's your interest in the Highlander Ilrig? I read a little bit on the blog about it, but I understand you're a real Highlander fan as well. I mean, you can tell. I think you can always tell in X-Plane when the aircraft that somebody's developed is something they really like versus something that they built to make some money with. Oh, you got to fly in a 2T? Well, that explains an awful lot. Are you in the Frisian region by any chance? Saba, yeah, I think so. The piston was a bit tight at Saba. Here's 1500 feet, so I'm just going to lower the nose. I said I was going to keep the power on, so I should probably do that. That's not the button I wanted to push. What did that do? That's right. So I should go a bit faster with the props forward. But you pay the price on the fuel flow. Oh my goodness, okay, Papua New Guinea. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Because I was wondering, I can't remember the name, is it FLN in northern Germany? They operated the Islanders, I don't know if they still do. But yeah, the Islander is all over the world, you see them working. But the turbine would really help in Papua New Guinea, I think. From the Western European perspective, the high altitude performance doesn't really matter so much, or the altitude performance, and the hot temperature doesn't really matter so much. But the piston, if you take it away from Bembridge, it can be quite limited, if that makes sense. Oh, sweet. Oh, that makes sense. Oh, nice to see it in the sim then. Helgoland, that's the one. So who wants to do the fuel burn calculation for me? We are burning 440 pounds of fuel per hour at the moment, and we're doing 100 and it'll work out to be about 175 ground speed at low level. What's 440 pounds in gallons per hour? Bearing in mind in the TBM, I'll be back at probably around about 60 gallons per hour low level. Yeah, there you go. Pretty thirsty, huh? That's why it's got these extra tanks. Fuel level's sufficient. But that's the thing, is if you're flying it in your sim, you can fly fast. It's nice to be able to go fast if you want to. Quick view outside. This for me is what the Islander is all about. You know, it's a part of the world that I really enjoy. I don't get home as much as I really should do, and certainly over the past 18 months I haven't been home at all. So it's nice to visit it in the sim. We'd usually try and get up to Scotland in the winter to go skiing, just for a day or so, a couple of days, and it just hasn't been possible recently. And I think X-Plane's lighting effects at sunset, it's really nice now, really nice. 258 metres, yeah, that's a bit on the tight side, isn't it? I think the shortest licensed runway in the UK is about 470, and people were operating Piper Tomahawks out of there. Can you believe that? Not for me, not brave enough, if that's the word. Right, we've got the... I'm kind of out of sequence now. Did I switch that off? I didn't switch it back on. Right, ignition, fuel pumps. All is good. 255 metres takeoff run. What's the distance to 50 feet with that? It must be around about 400 or so. It really can, yeah, 350, goodness me. I think I'm looking forward to seeing the updated flight model in the Piston as well. On those 500 metre strips out on Coll where we've just been to, it needs to be quite light to get out of there with no wind, whereas actually it shouldn't struggle there. So I think the Piston was maybe about 10 to 15% underpowered. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Better ground roll, wash to 50 feet, that makes sense. It's a very difficult thing to measure in the sim. I really tried to measure the distances, but I guess you need to write something specific to do that. Anyway, the props are already up, speed's coming back through 120. Oban's directly ahead of us. This is where we did the gliding video. Jono, I can't at the moment. I will have a look at my download history and see if I can work out what it is. Something Skypack, somebody's name Skypack rings a bell. Is there an Eddie Skypack? Is there maybe Eddie? I don't know. It's something like that. Eddie Skypack. It might be that. Might be that. So Ben Laura is the big hill ahead of us. Oban is on it's North Connell, really, on the right-hand side. And you see when we land at North Connell, the local council, during that Argyle Air Services project I was telling you about a few years back, decade and a bit back now, they had the feeling that if they made the runway slightly longer, you would be able to get Ryanair and EasyJet to come visit Oban in an Airbus or a 737. It's not really a 737 runway, not with the hill. You know, that hill is directly the threshold. And you can, I mean, it's a curving approach, and it's not an issue in an Islander, but it might be a bit exciting in a 737. Right, speed's under the first flat limiting stage, so I'll take the first stage. I'll hold the pitch out of trim for a second as the speed bleeds back. Last sector of the day, this is the one where you screw it up if you're not careful. I haven't set my OBS or anything, but I know where I'm going at. He says before executing a missed approach. Flaps out, props up, brakes off. It's probably long enough for a 737, it's just that lump of terrain. We'll turn final over the caravan park, take the final stage of flap. You don't need full flap to land Islander, you can land partial flap. Excuses, excuses. I was looking at the scenery, Amy. Last sector of the day, that's the day that's the one that you want to auto land on, really. You see, at 65 knots, you can make any airfield work. So looking at the far end of the runway, power on roughly to the flare. Oh, it's a bit high. A reflare. Reverse idle. Oh, I forgot you were listening for that bit, Amy. Yes, that's right. You've got to be above top descent or the excuses don't count. My bad. Right, stick it into beta. Was me. Right, bring the flaps up, gentle brake application, and we'll turn around and we'll park it up and call it quits after that. Whilst I'm taxiing in, it's really nice to have Ulrich here. I think Ulrich and Stephen and Coop, they've done an awesome job, and the other guys at TorqueSim. I love this thing. I think it's absolutely fantastic. I would not be saying that if I didn't truly believe it. I'm very grateful that they gave me access to the beta version. If they hadn't given me access to the beta version, I would have still been flying it tonight, regardless, because it's an aircraft that I really enjoy, and it's lots of little improvements over the Piston that have made a huge difference. Does anybody have any questions you'd like answered as we taxi in? Doesn't have to go to the Islander. I can't give you answers on vaccination, but other than that, aviation related stuff, you can probably do. It's got to be a screenshot, huh? In we go. Should you buy GameStop stock? I don't really know. I've been keeping an eye on that story. How brave do you feel, Pilsner? Can you stand to lose it? It's nice, isn't it, Amy? I need to remap my throttle. Stephen showed us on the testing forum that you can set the beta range on your hardware throttle. The only consideration with that is you don't have a detent, so it will drop into beta if you're not careful on landing. So I'm currently thinking if I can jerry-rig something for my joystick that will give me a detent. Bit of beta back here. But yeah, it works. It's really good. We have got the parking brakes set, so what do we need to do? One more time. We are going to double check that the ignition and the fuel pumps selected off. I'm going to switch off the avionics. I'm going to turn off the generators because I don't know if you have to or if you don't. I'm going to bring both of the levers together. So feather. And while it's shutting down, I'm going to reset the trim. Bearing in mind that with the electrics off you don't have electric trim. That prop stopped, that prop stopped. With that in mind we can turn off the fan, which is making an annoying noise. Turn off the cabin lights, the noses, the beacon. I'm going to leave the nav lights on because I always do. Cockpit lights off and the crash bar is down. Again, if it was a piston, it would be throttle mixture fuel mags. Same sort of thing here. We've got the throttle, the condition, and the switches are off. Let's open the doors. You know what, let's leave the doors and let's go outside and see if we can get another screenshot, because this is just the setting at Oban. I've got a photo that one of my friends took of an airplane that we used to fly together, parked in this very spot at Oban, and it just looks stunning in the sunset. What am I using now to engage beta if not a moving throttle axis? That's a good question. So let me go in and I'll show you how that works, Pilsner. There's the toggle, I've got toggle reverse and toggle beta. Okay, so in normal position, that's my lever going forwards and coming backwards. I have to push, if I push toggle beta, it doesn't do anything initially. So I've got to toggle reverse, and now as I push my hardware throttle forward, the reverse increases, so it's working back to front. So I just imagine that as when the paddle on my joystick throttle is up, that's the brakes, and when it's down, the brakes are off. And once it's in the reverse detent, you toggle beta, and then you've got it in the beta range. Now that's also working in reverse sense. So full forward gives me less beta, and full back. So basically the hardware idle position is always this middle section here. But you can put in curves to make it do it on the mappings, and you can also, you could make a change in plane maker if you wanted to, such that you would have the beta and the reverse range. It's possible to do either way. The way the TBM does it is, in my opinion, is the optimal solution, but that's a lot more complicated to implement because it uses the full axis of the joystick, as if you don't have those gates on there, but it uses the reverser toggle as a gate to stop it being able to go below flight idle or ground idle. That's the perfect scenario. So with the TBM, you have to come back to the stops, and then you push the toggle reverse, and that effectively opens up that range for your hardware. But it all works, so that's like 100%, and all the way back there, that's 0%, and you get it in one smooth movement on the TBM. But it's completely serviceable. You don't even have to use beta. You can just toggle between reverse and forwards, and you're good to go. Right, let's get the doors open. One last look at the outside of it. That's your TorqueSim britten-norman turbine islander. Brilliant. I don't know what else to say about it. It's my sort of airplane. I had a lot of fun with the Piston. I must have flown, I can't even remember how many hours I flew the Piston. I know that on release day, my X-plane had been running for 14 hours on release day, and my family wondered what had happened to me. And this one looks even better. So I would highly, if you're into this sort of airplane, I strongly recommend it. Guys, thanks so much for joining us on the sim, and it's a pleasure to have the developers in the stream as well. I'm very happy with the product you've produced, and it's really nice to see some Islander attention in the simulator as well. An intervention might be required. Yeah, I'm a bit gushy about it, huh? Thanks very much for joining me. Do take care. Enjoy the rest of your evening if you've still got some sunlight left. Otherwise, don't stay up too late. Stay safe, and I hope you join me again next time. Maybe we'll have a look at the TBM next week. Thanks so much, folks.